if you go with the assumption that people always pay attention to what they're doing and that they'll always understand what you're presenting, then you've basically set yourself up 100% for failure. You've got to figure out exactly what they will pay attention to and how they'll do it and plan it around that.
You're listening to Discussing Stupid, a podcast sponsored by Hi Monkey. Join your host, Virgil Carroll, and others as our podcast helps you transform bad digital experiences into teachable moments you can use.
I'm not a political person by nature, and so this is not a political episode, but it might be an episode that is kind of motivated by something that recently happened that a lot of people think of as political, and that is Signalgate. And so I'm not going to talk about this from a political perspective, but I am going to talk about it from a user experience perspective, because the reality is there is a good reason that we have the field of user experience and everything that goes along with it, and that is because people will do really stupid things. And I wish that I could say that what happened in that particular instance is not something I've seen before in other scenarios, but it is. And so today we're going to spend some time kind of talking about why it's important to do user experience type testing and evaluating and just having an overall philosophy around making things easier for people. Because the reality is, much like the title of our podcast, people do stupid things, and we always have to make sure that we're handling those. So you're right. The whole point is, and kind of going off of Signalgate, that kind of stuff, but just there, it's like there's a reason we need usability, and the reason is people do stupid things all the time. I mean, and that's kind of the point is, if people paid attention and they read well and they didn't, do things like look at a meme, we weren't in a meme culture, we weren't in that kind of stuff, it would be. But one of the problems that, a lot of orgs have from the standpoint of, kind of building out user experiences, digital user experiences in particular, is that people don't pay attention. And that's not something new. That's been for a long time. People don't do it, and so a lot of times we build interactions that require people to pay attention to what they're doing and that. So,
Yeah, although it's not like new, I feel like it is getting worse.
oh, it
Um,
is. Yeah, yeah. I even remember like working back with Deed and the unemployment system, just how many struggles people have with it. And that's because that system, you have to pay a lot of attention to what you're doing in there. And most people just don't. And so they end up they I know they've done some improvements to the system, but overall, part of the thing was they said that the system actually, where it took care of some routine things overall from the applicant side, it probably increased their call volume. So they needed actually a bigger call center because people would call because they didn't understand how to do things, or they do them wrong and they'd get denied, benefits and that kind of stuff. It's an interesting area that, there's a reason we need user experience and to make interaction simple is because we can't rely on the fact that people are going to understand the kitschy, more complex things we do. And if the
yeah,
goal of the site is to get them to be successful and go where we want them to go, then we've got to make that easy and not try to make it fancy.
yeah, I guess in like preparing for this episode, I was like kind of battling with two like different ideas around this topic, and it's like, okay, do people need to be more attentive and like intentional with how they're using technology? Does it fall on the people, or does it fall on like the people who are, designing the tech that people use? And I think it's a little bit of both
Well, I
because
mean, it's both, but give up on the people using it. I mean, that doesn't happen. We are a generation now that, you press big buttons on a phone and it makes stuff happen. And so you can wish that all you want, but the reality is you know, there's the part of the experience you can affect, and there's a part of experience you can't affect. And that when I sit down with people and talk about this, I always say, sure, we want our users to do exactly what we want them to do, but here's the reality. We have no control over them because our people that visit our sites could be anybody on the planet in that. And guess what? We can't control what anybody on the planet does in that. What we can control is what we do and how we present things and how we make them accessible for them. And that really is the key to that, is that that's what we can do from our side in there. And it's amazing how many times I run into sites that it's just like they needed this and they wanted this outcome. So they built something specifically to that they understand internally. So that whether it's their marketers or their IT, like, oh, we know how this works. Yeah. And then they're always shocked that nobody else on the planet did. It makes me laugh because to me this is not a rocket science type thing. Yes, building good user interfaces and good interaction experience in that is not just something you can do simply and easily, but overall, it's not something that you should be surprised you need to do. And it's amazing how much we do. And recent current events have definitely shown that you know, people do stupid things, even in very important, sensitive areas. People will just do stupid things.
Where do you think AI fits in this whole equation? Because
Yeah. Well, you know my opinion on AI, and probably people that listen to it are starting to understand my opinion on AI. There's some interest. I mean, the one thing I think that if I was to go first to a benefit of AI in this is AI has no emotion. And a lot of times things that get done in a bad way are because of emotion. It's because people think, well, but I really needed to do this, or I really know this is the way I want it to go, or this is something important to me. The emotion of it versus the objectability of what if you're trying to build something that every person on the planet can use? What do you need to do to make that happen? Now, of course, a lot of people would argue, if I'm an engineering company in Minnesota and I have an engineering site, that's probably not such a big deal because not everybody on the planet is going to go there. But you and I both know, when we look at our, Google Analytics and that people all over the world visit our site all the time. We have no idea why. I mean, sometimes it's to read one of our blog post articles or something like that, but they just do that. But AI has this objectivity. Otherwise, it's going to look at things very much based on, kind of analytics and analysis and everything else. And it doesn't have any emotion to why it makes the decision. On the other side, the part that I find funny about AI is how much people just take what it gives you back at face value and says, well, this is true. You might remember when you and I were first looking at ChatGPT and kind of exploring it as a something to help us out with, speed up some of our marketing stuff and that, just so that we don't always have to generate initial content. And you might remember that I asked it to tell me about High Monkey. Do you remember that? And then just how
yeah.
the first paragraph was awesome. It was very accurate, and then it went down this path, and it was like, it was like I was part of a big conglomerate and all this stuff like that. And it was like, well, none of that's true. And it's like it just made up crap from there. So I think it has some options on there, but the reality is from an AI standpoint, if you ask AI to build you a user interaction, it will probably build you that user interaction, but that doesn't mean that user interaction is easy to use. And that's what a lot of people are doing is they're trying to build things so that people understand and good content and all that kind of stuff. And it's amazing how much AI generates like really difficult to understand content. I've seen that. I've seen people use it to plan out interactions and it does it, but it doesn't do it in a way that's meaningful to the people. So the reality is we're starting to use these technologies in just internal roundtables and discussions of that to replace what we really need to be doing, which is talking to the people that actually use our stuff and figuring out what would be easiest for them and what would make the most sense for them. And that's the piece of it that is really like, well, from there.
I think it with AI, it becomes kind of the biggest problem, at least in my eyes, when people are just taking the responses that they're getting out of the, GPTs, and then just taking that at face value and not like using their critical thinking skills to think on if this is like something I should really follow through with or not. I think either way, if you're going to use AI right, you need to like still be using your brain and then like iterate, iterate, iterate. I mean, most people aren't going to do that. So that's where it's kind of why I wanted to bring up AI, because it's like people are just
I
using
make
it
sense.
and
Yeah. Well, and it's not even AI, it's just other tools. I mean, how many times do we evaluate tools, whether to use internally or use with a customer? And it's like this one does these things really well and this thing does this really well. But guess what? We need both of those, but neither of them do both of them great. And so I can't tell you how many times I've looked at a lot of tools and been like, man, if we could just have this piece from this piece from this piece, and this piece from this piece, it'd be there. But then you'd go to another company and they're like, "Well, we don't really need that. We need this and this, but we don't need that, but we need this up here and that." And that's kind of the problem for it is that, I mean, it's the reason usability is out there in the first place and that there's, so much information about it and that and organizations need to take that as, really actionable things that they have to do. And it's still amazing how many websites or internal systems or software products or that are still driven by what internal people think
yeah.
somebody wants.
And speaking
And
of actionable things to do, please like and subscribe and follow us and share this podcast, because that helps a lot. We need some new listeners because we like talking about this stuff. But we gotta get more ears familiar with the Discussing Stupid
yeah,
podcast.
that's very true. I mean, and it's all a process and that it's amazing. I mean,
Yeah.
you even take a podcast like this and you've got to release it across 20 different kinds of channels. You have to be on YouTube, you have to be an audio version, you have to do really cool graphics for the video. You've got all these things to be able to try and get people to do that. It just is what it is. I mean, it's just like with us doing our website and talking about like screen sizes and that kind of stuff. You've got to have things that fit like 500 different screen sizes, and people just don't think about that stuff. I mean, it is. And, which is why I think it's such an interesting topic to talk about because even though people might be, well, this is stuff we know, it's like, well, sure, it's things but does anybody actually do anything with it in that? So it still amazes me today, how many times we enter situations or we come in after a situation where somebody's like, well, we talked about it, but we just never really looked at this as an important thing. And now once they've gotten feedback that the site was very difficult to use or people wasn't finding things or whatever their objectives were doing it. And they're like, well, what happened? And it's like, well, did you ever go out and talk to people and actually see if that's what they wanted to do and that's how they wanted to do it? And no, and that. And so, there's this concept that, because we're the company, we know the product and we know what everybody wants. And all I can say is throughout my entire 27 years of doing this, nobody's been right ever.
I was thinking about how people who are making interfaces for people to use, how can they like counteract the tendency towards inattention with users? And some things that came to mind were, designing with user limitations in mind, just thinking about how inattentive people are and doing user testing. I
Mhm.
think that's a big thing. And then also,
Yeah.
in general, having
Well,
more.
I mean, I always say you have to build to the lowest common denominator. You have to think who is your most simplistic user you're ever going to have on your site in that. And so you have to look at things like, like the minimum federal standard of an eighth grade reading level. I mean, yeah, that's a requirement by government websites, but overall it's a great rule of thumb because you never know that you're going to have somebody that is highly advanced in their knowledge visiting your site. You have to look at things. I mean, I can tell you back, back in 2001, I can think of this specifically in 2001. I was working on a project, and it was a group of people, in just kind of an interesting. I'm not going to say it because I don't want to pick on any types of worlds, but it was just an interesting group of people, and I did a bunch of usability tests with them, and it was amazing how many of them were conflicted by having a button that said the word continue versus a button that said the word next. Now, to me, that should be the exact same thing and not it. But it was amazing how many they were like, "Well, what am I continuing?" And we don't really think about that people actually think about these things. In today's world where there's so much more chance of malicious activities and going to wrong websites, and people are getting more educated about that. People are more cautious about completing processes that they don't feel 100% confident about. And so a lot of times that's where you can look like if you're an e-commerce site, you can look at like abandoned carts and that kind of stuff. And a lot of times, like, was it they didn't want this, or did they not understand how to finish the process, or did they not have confidence in finishing the process? So there's lots of things like that that you can look at from that side. But yeah, I mean, the biggest thing is if you don't know and you're unsure, ask. I mean, in simplest terms, I mean, you can do testing, you can do a lot of fancy things and do that, but it's amazing how many people just don't call up a customer and say, "Hey, wondering what you think of X process or this part of our site." And, obviously we've done that with our podcast with some of our customers that we know are listening to it, and getting their feedback on it and getting some really good feedback on it, which is one of the big reasons we changed the intro to the podcast. And we've actually already seen a benefit that, before that we were getting people to listen to about the first 17 seconds of the intro, and that was it. And now we're up to over 2 minutes, which is actually getting into the podcast itself, in there. So that's a big, win.
Well, nothing will ever replace user feedback.
Right, exactly. And I think that's the lesson is, if you go with the assumption that people always pay attention to what they're doing and that they'll always understand what you're presenting, then you've basically set yourself up 100% for failure. You've got to figure out exactly what they will pay attention to and how they'll do it, and plan it around that.
All right. Well, I think we gave some good little tidbits of actionable insights here, how to create some better user experiences for people. Thanks everyone for tuning in to this week's episode.
Yep. Thank you. Just a reminder, we'll be dropping new episodes every 2 weeks. If you enjoyed the discussion today, we would appreciate it if you hit the like button and leave us a review or comment below. And to listen to past episodes or be notified when future episodes are released, visit our website at www.discussingstupid.com and sign up for our email updates. Not only will we share when each new episode drops, but also we'll be including a ton of good content to help you in discussing stupid in your own organization. Of course, you can also follow us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or SoundCloud, or really any of the other favorite podcast platforms you might use. Thanks again for joining, and we'll see you next time.